Dr. Evelyn Reeves stood in the mirror of her quarters and saw a woman with no weapons, no rank insignia on her shoulders, no security detail waiting outside the door, no tech armor humming at her wrists, just a diplomat in a black formal dress, hair pinned back, hands empty. The Velthar would see her walk into that banquet and see exactly what she wanted them to see, a lesser being, a human who could be broken. She was counting on it. The palace halls were lined with Velthar guards in ceremonial dress, tall, segmented armor that caught the light like insect chitin. They watched her pass. One of them smiled, a thin expression that did not reach his eyes. Reeves did not smile back. She did not slow. She simply moved forward, one step after another, toward the great dining chamber where the real predators were waiting. The banquet hall was enormous. Vaulted ceilings stretched up into shadow. Long tables formed a U-shape with the Velthar nobility arranged by faction. Reeves recognized the arrangement from her briefing files. On the left side sat the traditionalists, those who believed humanity had no place in Velthar space. On the right, the reformers, those who saw the trade accord as profitable. And at the head, neutral enough to seem impartial, sat the council observers. Councillor Thren sat at the left table. He was older than his file photos suggested, with silver streaking through the dark ridges of his exoskeleton. His eyes tracked Reeves as she entered, and she watched them narrow slightly. Calculation. He was already deciding what she was worth. A junior aide approached her with a gesture that might have been welcoming or dismissive. The Velthar language of body position worked in layers Reeves still did not fully understand. She followed him to her seat, a place of honor that was also a place of absolute isolation. She would sit alone at the center of the head table, visible to everyone, defenseless in open space. Perfect. The first course arrived. Something that steamed, something that Reeves had been assured would not kill her. She had eaten worse. She had also eaten better on better days with better company. She pushed the thought away. Sentiment had no place here. Dr. Reeves, a voice called out. It belonged to a Velthar female with bright, metallic chitin. She sat 4 seats down and was smiling in that particular way that meant she was about to say something cruel. I have read about your species. You have such a short lifespan. How do you manage to accomplish anything meaningful in so little time? Reeves set down her fork. She turned to face the woman directly. Stillness. She had learned that silence was a weapon the Velthar did not know how to counter. It made them anxious. It made them talk. Efficiently, Reeves said. The woman's smile widened. She turned to her companions and spoke in rapid Velthar, a series of clicks and whistles that Reeves understood perfectly but chose not to react to. The other nobles laughed. Reeves returned to her food. The dinner progressed. More jabs came, each one gentler than the last. The Velthar were testing boundaries, looking for the point where the human would break, where she would cry, where she would become interesting. Reeves gave them nothing. She ate. She listened. She did not respond to provocations that were meant to wound. Then Councillor Thren stood. The room quieted. He was important enough that his silence held weight. To the new accord, he said, raising his glass. The words were formal, but his tone was layered with implications. To the accord that would not last, to the human delegation that would not survive, to the fragile arrangement that Thren intended to break. And to our guest, Dr. Reeves, may she enjoy her time among us. The last phrase hung in the air like poison. May she enjoy her time, not may she stay, not may our partnership flourish. May she enjoy it while she lasts. Reeves lifted her own glass and drank. Then the second course came, and with it came the beginning of the real work. A Velthar male Reeves did not recognize, younger, probably in Thren's faction based on his seating, reached across the space between them and deliberately tipped his wine glass. It fell with theatrical precision, the dark red liquid spreading across the white tablecloth and then onto Reeves's dress. Cold wine was cold. The room went very still. Reeves stood. She did not gasp. She did not curse. She simply looked at the stain, then at the male who had caused it, then back at the stain. Her hands, when she examined them, were steady. "How careless," she said quietly. "This is a Venusian silk, very delicate." She excused herself and walked to the washing station without waiting for a response or apology. She did not storm. She did not display anger. She simply moved with the kind of calm that suggested this inconvenience was beneath her notice. Behind her, she heard the conversations resume, heard the low laughter. The male had won a small victory. He had humiliated the human. He had proven that her dignity was something they could take from her whenever they wanted. Reeves cleaned the wine stain with methodical precision, using the techniques she had learned years ago in a previous life, in a previous war, when she had been a different kind of operative. She watched herself in the mirror. She observed the woman looking back, the woman who was terrified, the woman whose heart was beating fast, the woman who wanted to run. That woman's fear was useful. Reeves locked it away and kept moving. When she returned to the banquet hall, she sat down and picked up her fork. She continued eating. She continued listening. And she continued the work that had actually brought her to Velthar space, the work that no one in this room understood. She was not here to be accepted. She was not here to prove humanity's worth. She was here to take inventory of people, of systems, of weaknesses, of the way that predators always made the same mistake. They assumed that anything small must be harmless. The wine spiller reached for his glass again, and Reeves noticed something the others did not. His hand trembled, slightly, just barely. He was afraid of something, or someone. Reeves filed this information away in the same part of her mind where she was cataloging guard rotations and door locks, and the way the Velthar water system sounded through the walls at night. It was a small detail, but small details were how you dismantled empires. The banquet continued, the insults continued, and Reeves sat very still, gathering everything. The second course arrived, and so did the alcohol. The Velthar began to drink. Their exoskeletons flushed with color as the drinks took hold, and their careful diplomatic masks began to slip. This was what Reeves had been waiting for. This was when the predators became careless. This was when they started teaching her exactly how they planned to kill her. Counselor Thren's faction grew louder, more confident. Reeves watched from her isolated seat as they began to speak more freely, their conversation shifting from formal diplomatic language to something closer to genuine discussion. A female named Velkara, who held some kind of military authority based on her rank insignia, leaned forward and began to speak. "The human colonies are stretched thin," she said, her words slightly slurred. "I have reviewed the patrol schedules. They think we do not look. They think their defenses are invisible to us, but I have seen them. There are gaps, large gaps. In Sector 7, there is a window of nearly 30 days where they have scheduled maintenance on their primary defense platforms." Reeves picked up her napkin. She folded it into quarters, then into eighths. She did this with great care, her eyes on the task, her ears on every word. The Velthar at Thren's table were laughing now, truly laughing, not the careful smiles they had deployed earlier. 30 days, someone asked. Is the human so stupid they would advertise their own weakness? Not stupid, Velkara said. They simply do not believe we would move against them. They think the accord is real. They think we have agreed to peace. Reeves folded the napkin again. The geometry of it was pleasing. 4 folds, 8 folds, 16. She had always found comfort in precision, in the idea that chaos could be rendered into order if you were patient enough. Thren spoke then, and his voice carried the weight of someone announcing something previously decided. "The summit is in 47 days, he said. "The council will gather, all factions will be present, and on that day we will present the case for the dissolution of the human accord. We will propose repatriation of human settlers to their home system. We will reclaim the colonial spaces they have contaminated with their presence. And if the council hesitates, we will have reasons. compelling reasons. Infrastructure failure, trade violation, negligence. He turned to look at Reeves directly. The human government will not be able to refuse. They will have no legal standing, and their representative here will have done nothing to prevent it because she will understand, by then, the futility of resistance. Reeves did not look up from her napkin. She folded it once more. A younger Velthar, someone with less confidence in his expression, spoke up. His exoskeleton was still relatively smooth, unmarked by the scarring that came with age and rank. But the accord has been ratified by the Trade Authority. We cannot simply dissolve it without. We can dissolve it, Thren interrupted, if there is evidence of human violation, if there is proof of negligence, if there is documentation showing that humans cannot maintain the basic infrastructure necessary for a functional settlement. The implications were now clear. Thren was not going to invade. He was not going to wage war. He was going to use the very systems the humans had helped establish to prove that they were unfit to participate in them. He was going to use bureaucracy as a weapon. Reeves understood this. She had expected this. But understanding something intellectually and watching it being planned in real time were two different things. Velkhara continued, emboldened by alcohol and confidence. The colony at Port Haven is their primary hub. I have contacts in the maintenance division there. We have been watching their water filtration systems deteriorate for months. The specifications are not being met. If we file a formal complaint with the Trade Authority about infrastructure compliance, an inspection will be mandatory. And once those inspectors arrive, they will find everything I have been documenting. They will find what we want them to find, another voice added. And by then, Thren said, it will be too late for the human to do anything about it. She is one woman. She is defenseless. And even if she were not, she would have no allies. The Neutral Council will see the evidence and vote accordingly. The trade accord will dissolve. The colonies will be reclaimed. And humanity will learn the cost of assuming they belong in Velthar space. Reeves felt her heart rate pick up. She controlled her breathing. She kept folding the napkin, fold after fold after fold. The paper was growing soft now, worn from repeated creasing. Soon it would tear. The younger Velthar spoke again, still uncertain. What if the human brings evidence? What if she? She is a xenolinguist, Thren said with obvious contempt. A scholar, a cultural observer. She has no authority to challenge military or infrastructure assessments, and even if she did, she is alone. When she returns to her ship, she will file a report. By the time her government responds, the inspection will already be underway. The momentum will already be in motion, and momentum in bureaucracy is everything. Reeves set down the napkin. It lay in neat folds on the table, a small geometric tower of paper that she had constructed from chaos. The Velthar did not seem to notice what she had been doing. They saw only a human woman anxious enough to fidget. It confirmed everything they believed about her. The dinner continued. More courses arrived. More alcohol flowed. And with each passing hour, Thren's faction became more confident, more detailed, more generous with information. By the time dessert was served, Reeves had learned the names of every key player in the conspiracy. She had learned the timeline. She had learned the vulnerabilities in their plan, and more importantly, she had learned their assumptions about her. They assumed she was frightened. They assumed she was powerless. They assumed that a woman who could be humiliated at a dinner table could be defeated by processes and paperwork. They were wrong, but they would not know it until it was far too late. As the banquet began to wind down, Reeves caught the eye of the younger Velthar, the one who had expressed doubt. He looked away quickly, but not before she saw something in his expression. Shame, or fear, or perhaps the terrible knowledge that he was party to something that should not have been spoken aloud in a room where enemies were listening. Reeves made a mental note of his position, his faction, his hesitation. He might be useful later. She stood to leave, and several of the Velthar raised their glasses in a mockery of respect. She had survived the banquet. She had been humiliated and had endured. In their minds, this meant she was beaten. But as Reeves walked out of that enormous hall, past the guards with their insect armor and their casual cruelty, she was already running calculations. Numbers, dates, infrastructure vulnerabilities, and bureaucratic pathways. She was already building the architecture of her response. The Velthar had made a critical error. They had assumed that defenselessness meant helplessness. They had shown her their weapons and their plans, never understanding that the most dangerous information is the information that people volunteer when they believe they have already won. Reeves returned to her quarters and locked the door. She accessed her secure communication system and began to upload everything: the audio recording of the banquet, the names, the dates, the conspiracy laid out in perfect detail. By the time she finished, it was very late, very quiet, and the trap that the Velthar thought they had set for her was already springing shut around them. The next morning, a message came. Counselor Thren requested a private meeting with Dr. Reeves. The tone was cordial. The timing was a message in itself. He was moving quickly, overconfident, certain that the human woman would understand the futility of her position now that she had been given 24 hours to process her defeat. Reeves dressed carefully. No armor, no weapons, just a simple suit and the appearance of someone who had slept poorly and thought carefully about her situation. She wanted to look exactly as Thren expected her to look: diminished, concerned, already negotiating the terms of her surrender. The council chambers were different from the banquet hall, more formal, more austere. The walls were paneled in something that looked like dark metal but was actually a Velthar material that dated back centuries. Reeves examined it as she walked, noting the slight discoloration where water damage had occurred in the distant past. Even their monuments had vulnerabilities. Everything did. Thren stood when she entered, a gesture of respect, or perhaps a gesture of a predator preparing to strike. Hard to say with Velthar. "Dr. Reeves," he said, his voice warm, almost grandfatherly. "Please sit, we have much to discuss." Reeves sat. She folded her hands in her lap and waited. Thren began to pace, as if working through a difficult problem. "I have been thinking about humanity's position in Velthar space," he said. "It is precarious, fragile. The accord you came to celebrate is not as secure as your government believes. There are those of us who question whether humans have the capacity to maintain the necessary infrastructure for a functional colonial presence. There are those of us who wonder if this partnership has already run its course." Reeves said nothing. She simply looked at him, her expression neutral, attentive. "If I were advising your government," Thren continued, "I would suggest they make a preemptive withdrawal, a tactical retreat from 3 of their most remote colonies: Port Desolation, The Reach, Crimson Station. These are expensive to maintain anyway. The population is small. The strategic value is minimal. If your government were to voluntarily withdraw, they could then negotiate for a secure presence in the remaining colonial spaces. They could avoid the embarrassment of a formal review and a probable forced evacuation." Reeves felt the weight of what he was offering. A choice between humiliation and capitulation. Between losing those 3 colonies through a bureaucratic process that would take weeks, or abandoning them now, immediately, as a gesture of good faith. "In exchange," Thren said, sitting down across from her, "humanity retains its place in the accord. Your species continues to have a presence in Velthar space. Your government avoids the scandal of a failed colonial experiment. Everyone benefits from a clean solution to a problem that has become untenable." Reeves took a moment. She let him see her thinking. Let him see her understanding the weight of the situation. Let him see her surrender forming. "That is a reasonable proposal," she said quietly. Thren's exoskeleton brightened slightly with relief. He had expected negotiation. He had expected resistance. The human woman capitulating this quickly was almost suspicious, but perhaps she was simply pragmatic. Perhaps she had understood from the beginning that her position was impossible. "I am glad you see the wisdom in it," Thren said. "I will have the proposal formally documented. Once it is signed by both parties, the process can begin immediately. Your government can announce the withdrawal as a strategic consolidation. No one needs to know the true circumstances." Reeves understood what he was doing. By insisting on documentation, Thren was creating a paper trail that would protect him from accusations of coercion. A signed agreement showed willing capitulation, not a forced retreat. But what Thren did not understand was that documentation cut both ways. "I think it would be important," Reeves said carefully, "to have a very detailed proposal. Something that clearly outlines the specific colonies being withdrawn, the timeline, and the strategic rationale. Something that future governments could consult if there were ever questions about how the accord evolved." Thren smiled. She was even more practical than he had thought. She wanted to ensure that future human administrations would understand that this withdrawal was voluntary, not evidence of weakness. "Of course," he said, "I will have my staff prepare something comprehensive." They continued talking for another hour. The proposal took shape. Thren, emboldened by what he perceived as Reeves's acceptance of defeat, began to add details. He specified not just the colonies being abandoned, but the timeline for abandonment. He noted the military justifications. He mentioned the inspection that would have forced the withdrawal anyway, framing it as something that Reeves had managed to avoid through her cooperation. By the time the meeting ended, Thren had essentially written a document confessing to exactly how far he intended to push his advantage. And he had done it at the table with Reeves as his witness. As Reeves stood to leave, Thren walked her to the door. "You have made a wise choice," he said. "Your government will be grateful." Reeves turned to look at him. For just a moment she let him see something in her expression. Not anger, not fear, not resistance, something more complicated, pity. "I hope so," she said. On the walk back through the palace corridors, Reeves absorbed every detail. She had seen the water system maintenance panel. She had noted the location of the security cameras. She had observed the pattern of guard rotations and the way the afternoon light hit the eastern wall, suggesting a structural weakness or a water damage issue that was being concealed. But more than any of that, she had obtained exactly what she needed. A formal proposal document, detailing Thren's conspiracy with enough specificity that it could never be claimed as miscommunication or misunderstanding. He had wanted to write the contract in blood. He had wanted Reeves to understand that her surrender was real, that she had been forced to choose between bad options. But in insisting on documentation, in creating a paper record of his threats and demands, Thren had given her something far more valuable than blood. He had given her written confession. That evening, Reeves sat in her quarters and reviewed the proposal document. Every word was perfect. Every detail was incriminating. Thren had been so careful to be thorough, to be clear, to ensure that future scrutiny would confirm that this had been done with Reeves's agreement. He had never once considered that her agreement was a game, that her surrender was a performance, that the only real victory would come not from her resistance, but from her cooperation. Reeves began composing her own documents, not responses to Thren, not appeals for help, legal filings with the trade authority, technical complaints about Velthar infrastructure, formal requests for independent inspections of colonial facilities. By the time she finished, Thren's coup window had been locked shut by bureaucracy and process, and he had no idea that the weapon he had used to threaten her had been turned back toward himself, pointed not at her colony settlements, but at the infrastructure of his own power. She encrypted everything and set the transmission to send at a specific time, early the next morning, just before dawn, just when Thren would be sleeping, dreaming of his victory, unaware that the woman he had attempted to break was building something far more dangerous than resistance. She was building a case. 16 hours later, the trade authority's automated acknowledgement system received 3 formal filings from Dr. Evelyn Reeves, representing the Earth Coalition Colonial Authority. The first was a formal complaint of hostile negotiation and attempted coercion. The second was a technical safety violation report against multiple Velthar-maintained colonial facilities. The third was a request for independent inspection of all Velthar colonial infrastructure, citing legitimate human concerns about compliance with trade authority safety standards. Each filing was accompanied by detailed documentation, audio recordings from the banquet, the proposal document that Thren had signed, technical specifications for the water filtration systems that Velkara had been planning to sabotage, everything that was needed to make the filings legally impossible to dismiss. The trade authority, being a neutral bureaucratic entity without faction allegiances, had no choice. The process was automatic. Once a complaint was filed with sufficient documentation, an inspection had to be scheduled within 30 days. Once infrastructure violations were formally reported, those facilities had to be assessed. The machinery that Thren had been planning to use against humanity had been redirected. It was now grinding toward him. Reeves received a communication from Earth Command at 300 hours. Not congratulations, not encouragement, just a simple message, acknowledged. She had done her job. The rest would be handled by people with more authority and larger resources. But authority and resources meant nothing if the momentum was already in motion, and Reeves had ensured that the momentum was in motion. She received a second communication at 5:30 hours. This one was from the junior Velthar who had expressed doubt at the banquet. His name was Kelmora. His message was brief and encrypted. "I am willing to cooperate. Contact me when appropriate." Reeves understood what this meant. The younger Velthar had realized that Thren's plan was going to fail. He had chosen a side. He had decided that survival meant distancing himself from the conspiracy and aligning with whoever was actually winning. This was useful information. This meant the conspiracy was already fracturing. This meant that Thren would spend his time managing internal faction politics instead of executing his coup. This meant he was already defeated. He just did not know it yet. But Reeves suspected he was beginning to understand. At 900 hours, the trade authority sent formal notification to the Velthar government. An inspection team would arrive within 20 days. All facilities would be made available for assessment. Full cooperation was mandatory. By 10:30 hours, the first cracks in Thren's coalition appeared. Velkara, who had been so confident about her sabotage plans, suddenly denied knowledge of anything. She claimed her remarks at the banquet were misunderstood. She denied the technical documentation. She distanced herself from Thren with the kind of speed that only comes from genuine fear. By noon, Thren himself was making statements. He claimed that the inspection was a misunderstanding. He claimed that human colonials had misinterpreted casual diplomatic conversation as threats. He claimed that the proposal document was merely a policy discussion, not a formal demand. But the damage was done. The neutral council members had already seen the evidence, already read the filings, already understood what Thren had been planning, and they had already begun to position themselves accordingly. Reeves watched from her quarters as the political landscape shifted. She did not celebrate. She did not allow herself satisfaction. She simply observed the way systems worked, the way pressure applied in exactly the right place could cause entire structures to collapse. At 1400 hours, she received a communication directly from Counselor Thren. His voice was different now, no longer grandfatherly, no longer confident, tight, controlled, frightened. "Dr. Reeves, I believe there has been a serious misunderstanding. I would like to meet with you again to clarify the situation." Reeves did not respond. There was nothing to clarify. Everything was proceeding exactly as planned. That evening she walked through the palace again. The guards did not meet her eyes. The servants moved faster when they saw her approaching. Word had spread. The human woman who everyone had assumed was defenseless had somehow managed to freeze the entire political apparatus of Velthar space. She found the maintenance room where she had seen the water system panel. She stood there for several minutes, examining the readings. The pressure was lower than it should have been. The filtration efficiency was declining. It was exactly the kind of infrastructure failure that Velkhara would have documented. Reeves made a note of it. She photographed the readings with her personal device. She was not going to use this information against the Velthar, but it was good to know that her observations had been accurate, that the vulnerabilities she had noted were real, that the Velthar systems, while advanced, were not invulnerable. Nothing was invulnerable. Everyone had weak points. The trick was finding them before they were used against you. She thought about Kelmora, the young Velthar who had been part of Thren's conspiracy but had chosen to abandon it when the trajectory became clear. He would probably be offered a position in the Neutral Council now. Reward for his cooperation. Incentive to remain loyal. Reeves did not judge him for this. Survival was survival, but she did understand that his willingness to provide testimony would make the case against Thren even stronger. It would turn this from a human complaint into a Velthar internal matter. It would make it impossible for Thren to claim victimhood or conspiracy. The inspection team arrived 18 days later. They came with equipment and assessments and the kind of clinical detachment that only neutral bureaucrats could manage. They examined the water systems. They reviewed the military deployment records. They interviewed staff members. And they found exactly what Reeves knew they would find. Infrastructure that was not quite failing, but was being allowed to fail. Maintenance schedules that had been delayed. Safety protocols that had been skirted. Enough evidence to suggest that Velkhara had been planning something, that Thren had known about it, and that the whole operation had been designed to create the impression of human negligence. When the preliminary report was released, it did not accuse anyone of anything directly. Bureaucracy was careful about accusations, but it did recommend that Velthar facilities be placed under additional oversight. It did suggest that certain individuals might benefit from retraining. It did propose that human participation in colonial development oversight might actually strengthen the accord rather than weaken it. In other words, it proposed the exact opposite of what Thren had been planning. Reeves received another communication from Earth Command, a longer one this time. Congratulations, recognition of her work, orders to begin negotiating an expanded human role in trade authority oversight. She had won, but the victory felt strange, not triumphant, not even satisfying, just inevitable, like something that had been set in motion the moment she walked into the banquet hall defenseless and had simply been waiting for everyone else to catch up to the conclusion that had already been written. She thought about Thren, about Velkhara, about all the people who had mistaken her silence for weakness, about the terrible confidence that came from assuming you already understood your opponent. Reeves had not defeated them with weapons or tactics or even particularly clever strategy. She had defeated them by listening, by remembering, by understanding that the most powerful thing she could do was help them defeat themselves. But the work was not finished. The inspection would continue. The political aftermath would take months. Reeves still had a job to do. She had a war to win. And it was being won not with explosions or bloodshed, but with documentation and procedure and the patient, grinding work of institutions turning against themselves. She sat down and began preparing her reports for the next phase. The real phase. The phase where humanity would start rebuilding its colonial presence, not by conquest, but by becoming too essential to remove. The Velthar had taught her how their systems worked. Now she was going to use those systems better than they could. 47 days after the banquet, the colonial summit convened in the same great hall where the Velthar had made their plans, and the human woman had folded napkins. Reeves stood at the window of her delegation quarters and looked down at the gathering. The hall was full now. Representatives from dozens of factions, observers from neutral powers, the machinery of bureaucracy at full operational capacity. She had been offered a place of honor at the head table. She had declined. Instead, she would sit with the trade authority observers in a position that was neither dominant nor subordinate. Just present, just official, just one more part of the administrative apparatus that would determine the future of colonial relations. Reeves dressed with the same care she had dressed for the banquet. No weapons, no armor, just a professional suit and the appearance of someone who had done her job competently and was now ready to move forward. The summit opened with speeches. Councillor Thren made a statement about the importance of the accord, the value of human partnership, and the necessity of maintaining stable relationships in colonial space. The words meant nothing. His tone meant everything. It was the tone of someone who had already lost and was trying to preserve dignity in retreat. The Trade Authority presented their findings: infrastructure integrity, settlement stability, the recommendation for expanded human participation in oversight. The presentation was clinical, efficient, and absolutely devastating to Thren's position. It did not accuse him of conspiracy. It simply made clear that the systems he had tried to sabotage were actually functional, that human colonists were actually competent, and that the accord had value precisely because of human involvement. Then Kelmora testified. The young Velthar did not dramatize what he had witnessed at the banquet. He simply stated facts. He had heard discussions of infrastructure sabotage. He had heard timelines mentioned. He had heard intentions clearly expressed. And he had realized that he could not remain silent without becoming complicit. Reeves watched Thren's face as his own subordinate dismantled his political position. She saw the understanding finally crystallize. Thren had lost, not to Reeves, not to human military superiority, not to external forces. He had lost to his own assumption that a woman without weapons was harmless. He had lost to his own careful documentation. He had lost to the bureaucratic systems he had tried to manipulate turning against him instead. The vote came at the end of the day. The accord was reaffirmed. Human participation in colonial oversight was expanded. Velthar facilities would be subject to enhanced monitoring, and new provisions were added that made it nearly impossible for any faction to weaponize infrastructure negligence in the future. Thren did not speak during the vote. He simply sat very still, exoskeleton darkened, and watched his coalition collapse into factions aligned with other council members. By the end, he had only his closest allies remaining. Not enough for political power, barely enough for survival. After the summit adjourned, Reeves encountered him in a corridor. Thren stopped when he saw her. For a moment, they simply looked at each other. The man who had believed himself to be a predator and the woman he had thought was prey. "You were never defenseless," Thren said quietly. "No," Reeves agreed. "But you believed I was. That was the only difference between what happened and what you planned." Thren studied her face, as if trying to find where he had miscalculated. As if the answer was written somewhere in her expression, and he just had to look hard enough. "I gave you weapons," he said. "I told you everything. I gave you documentation. I did this myself." "You did," Reeves said. "But you did it because you believed you had already won. You wanted me to understand that my defeat was certain. You wanted me to feel the weight of my powerlessness. And while I was doing that, you were teaching me exactly how to defeat you." She turned to leave, then stopped. "There is something you should understand," she said. "Humanity did not come to Velthar space to conquer. We came because we were looking for a place to belong. Your faction rejected that, but you did it by mistake. You thought we were weak. You thought we could be broken, and that mistake will shape the next 100 years of colonial development." She did not wait for a response. She simply walked away, leaving Thren standing alone in the corridor, finally understanding what he had done. That evening, Reeves received a communication from Earth Command, a long message this time, comprehensive, congratulations, official recognition, and a new assignment. She had been promoted. She would be returning to Earth briefly for briefing, then would be reassigned to a new post, not as a diplomatic attaché, but as the human representative to the Trade Authority Colonial Oversight Committee, a position of real power, a position that would allow her to shape how human colonies developed. The irony was beautiful. Thren had tried to force human withdrawal. Instead, he had accelerated human integration into the structures of Velthar space. He had tried to diminish humanity's role. Instead, he had created the circumstances for its expansion. Reeves sat in her quarters and looked at her formal dress, the one she had worn to the banquet. There was still a faint stain on the hem where the wine had splashed. She had kept it as a reminder, not of humiliation, but of the moment when everything had turned. That moment when a man had spilled wine on her and believed he had won. When he had made his only real mistake. He had shown her what victory looked like, and she had simply rearranged the pieces to get there herself. She thought about the napkin she had folded, about the geometric precision of it, the way something chaotic could be rendered into order if you were patient enough, the way a small piece of paper could be transformed into something solid, something meaningful, something that held its shape even when pressure was applied. The human colonies were like that too, small, scattered, seemingly fragile but patient, determined, waiting for someone to show them how to become essential. Reeves had shown them, and now Velthar space would learn to function differently. Humans would not be guests or competitors or invaders. They would be infrastructure, the foundations that everything else was built on, so essential that to remove them would cause collapse. It would take time. It would take patience. It would take 1,000 small decisions and documentations and bureaucratic victories, but it would happen. Because that was how humans won, not with weapons, with persistence, with systems, with the knowledge that the biggest structures could be dismantled if you found the right pressure points and applied force with absolute precision. The next morning, Reeves boarded the transport that would carry her home. She looked back once at the Velthar capital, at the palace where she had sat defenseless at a banquet and learned everything she needed to know about how to win a war. As the ship ascended and the planet fell away behind her, she realized something. She had come to Velthar space alone and without weapons. She was leaving alone and without weapons, but she was leaving with something far more valuable. She was leaving with victory, and everyone involved understood that they had lost to themselves. The Velthar had a saying, something about how careful you had to be with prey that seemed helpless, how a predator's greatest weakness was confidence. Reeves had learned that saying before she came, but now she understood why it existed, because the Velthar had learned it the hard way again and again across centuries. The defenseless ones were the ones most likely to destroy you. She set the ship to autopilot and settled into the observation deck to watch the stars. Ahead of her was Earth. Behind her was a war that had been won with bureaucracy and patience. And in the coming years, there would be more wars to win, more systems to navigate, more moments where humanity had to appear weak while being absolutely deadly. But that was all right. Humans were good at appearing one way while being another. It was one of their greatest strengths. It was the thing that had brought them to the stars, and it was the thing that would keep them there.